Between the distant echoes of early history, long before the flood, people believed the earth operated by rules we barely recognize now. The land looked like paradise, endless green, heavy air, forests that never seemed to end. But that beauty hid a nightmare. Plants rose with unnatural intensity. Creatures of impossible scale moved through the wilderness like living mountains. And inside the first cities, something not fully human sat on thrones ruling with brutal order and demanding tribute no one could refuse. In this video, we're going to rebuild what survival may have felt like in that pre-flood world. What it meant to live under the shadow of giant predators. How forbidden knowledge seemed to appear overnight. And what ancient traditions claim happened when sons of God crossed a boundary and came down, and the final piece explains why. In that story, total destruction wasn't framed as an overreaction, but as the only remaining option. Stepping outside your home back then would feel like walking into a world size for something else. Imagine a forest where the treetops are never visible. You look up and only see mist and more height. Ferns rise like towers. Massive leaf canopies lock the ground in permanent shade, as if the earth itself is wearing a green ceiling. And it wouldn't feel like normal sunlight on your skin. It would be bright yet strangely soft. A steady glow from above, like the sky is covered by a permanent veil. Some have proposed that ancient conditions may have included a thick atmospheric layer that stabilized climate, holding warmth, trapping moisture, and keeping temperatures almost unchanging. No harsh storms, no sudden shifts, just a constant damp heat, like living inside a global greenhouse. Tree trunks would be so wide they'd look like stone pillars. Some might be hollowed out, big enough for people to shelter inside, and gathering food wouldn't be casual, it would be a mission. Ropes, teams, hours of climbing. Planning like you're raiding a cliffside, but the plants wouldn't be your biggest worry. The real warning would come from the ground itself, a tremor, a vibration that makes you stop breathing. You turn your head, and you see movement. Not one creature, an entire herd. The book of Job describes something called Behemoth, a beast with enormous strength and unstoppable presence. Some readers connect that description to gigantic creatures beyond today's scale. And you can't ignore the signs they leave behind: steam rising from piles of waste, rich fertilizer, and a stench so strong you'd never get close enough to confirm anything. And they wouldn't be alone. Look upward, the air wouldn't feel safe either. Large flying reptiles, massive birds of pre-circling rivers, hunting, diving low. Sometimes snatching fish, sometimes something smaller. That's why roofs are reinforced. That's why walls are high, and that's why nobody walks alone when the light fades. The command given in Genesis, subdue the earth, sounds powerful until you ask a simple question. How do you subdue something that could crush your home just by shifting its weight? Only the sharp survived. The slow, the careless, the distracted nature removed them quickly. Every day was survival. Quiet, constant, exhausting. But here's the turn. Even with everything out there, the giant animals were not the deepest terror. The real nightmare began when people looked up and saw lights descending from the sky. Lights coming down, not meteors, not lightning. These were controlled movements, intentional and direct, approaching towns like they owned the land. Ancient traditions call them watchers. Stories say they didn't hide in shadows. They arrived openly, walking into public spaces, entering cities as if they were returning to property. And the first shock wasn't what they carried, it was their presence. They were taller than ordinary, men far beyond what anyone had seen walking upright. But height wasn't the most unsettling detail. Something about them felt charged, as if their skin held a faint glow, as if their eyes carried light in darkness. And then came what broke people emotionally. They knew things they shouldn't know. They spoke every language. They called strangers by name. They referenced private family stories that no one had ever shared. And they offered gifts that were impossible to resist. Seeds that grew faster, techniques for shaping metal, insight about the stars and cycles of the sky, hidden properties of plants and remedies, patterns in the heavens that sounded like power. Certain ancient writings even assign names to these leaders and describe what each one taught. One is linked with warfare and weaponry, another with spells and altered consciousness, another with star knowledge that turned human curiosity into obsession. It was like receiving centuries of advancement in one moment. And then the price became clear. They didn't demand gold, they demanded women. Genesis 6 describes a violation with unsettling simplicity. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, desired them, and took what they wanted. Not a polite request, not a mutual agreement, a taking. Families watched, powerless, as the line between the human world and something else was broken. And if those unions happened, if the ancient story is taken literally, then what followed wasn't just moral corruption. It was corruption in the blood. Women became pregnant. But what grew inside them wasn't described as ordinary life. Midwives would know instantly, this isn't a normal child. Stories depict infants born unusually large, too long, too heavy, already carrying a hunger that didn't fit a human body. Not a rare mutation, a pattern. The pregnancies were violent. The labor was brutal. Some accounts describe mothers who didn't survive the birth. Other stories describe babies opening their eyes immediately, and the room feeling different, like something cold entered the air, even in warmth. Whether you see those texts as literal history or symbolic myth, the intention is clear. This wasn't celebrated as a miracle. It was described like horror. They grew too fast. 6 months. Walking. 2 years. Strength beyond normal children. Accidents became tragedies, doors broken, furniture shattered, injuries during play. Not always out of cruelty, sometimes because power without awareness is still dangerous. By early childhood, they reached adult size. By adolescence, they were far beyond it. Some traditions claim heights of several meters, towering, unnatural, dominant. Maybe some of that is poetic exaggeration, but the message is consistent. These were not merely strong humans. They were biological titans. And then the darkest line, the most terrifying detail, wasn't their bodies, it was their minds. They learned quickly, spoke early, understood complex ideas, but they lacked empathy. Some ancient texts portray them as consuming everything human beings produce: grain, livestock, resources, until nothing remained. And then they didn't just want food, they wanted control. They treated humans like property. Why? Obey a father you could silence with one hand. By adolescence, violence wasn't rare. It was impulse. And when these hybrids reached full maturity, they didn't want to be sons anymore. They wanted to be kings. Imagine rulers several meters tall, with strength no court could challenge and appetites that drained entire regions. No police, no appeals, no trials. Their word was law. Those who resisted didn't lose an argument. They disappeared. Genesis calls them mighty men, men of renowned figures, celebrated and feared. In that world, fame wasn't about talent, it was about dominance. They built strongholds, massive stone structures, thick walls, fortified gates. They demanded tribute, grain, animals, valuables, and sometimes people. Statues rose in their honor. Rituals grew. Sacrifice became public theater. And the hierarchy was simple. They were on top. Everyone else was beneath. But there was a problem no empire can ignore. Supply. How do you feed beings like that? Some traditions describe a grim escalation. First the crops, then the livestock. And when that ran out, they began to look at humans differently. Not as citizens, as meat. It wasn't hidden. It became ritual public altars, terrified crowds, children growing up learning that human life is cheap. Genesis uses strong language to describe the world. The earth filled with violence, cruelty, oppression, bloodshed in the streets, and it wasn't an occasional collapse of temper. It was a constant state of moral decay. A society with no pause button. Some people see echoes of this theme in ancient myths: titans, monsters, devourers, half-gods. Whether you interpret that as memory, symbolism, or cultural reflection, the point is this. The story paints the pre-flood world as a place where power ruled openly, and fear was the air everyone breathed. And the giants weren't the only factor. Their fathers, the Watchers, are portrayed as continuing to teach forbidden things. Suddenly, ordinary humans have access to tools and practices that turn conflict into something far worse. It's not gradual development, it's acceleration like a technological leap without moral preparation. Imagine a society moving from simple tools to advanced metalwork almost instantly. Not as slow innovation as direct transfer. Some texts attribute weapon making to these teachings. Blades, shields, armor. For that, fights were close range, primitive, limited. After that, war becomes systematic, efficient, industrial in spirit. And the teachings weren't only about killing. They were about seducing, adornment, jewelry, cosmetics, metallurgy for beauty, techniques that turned appearance into strategy. Today, this seems normal. But in that ancient setting, it becomes social manipulation at scale. Vanity turns into a contest. Status becomes visual. Desire becomes an economy. And the culture begins to rot from the inside out. Other teachings are described as roots and enchantments, things that alter perception and open doors that shouldn't be opened. And then astrology. Not simply studying the sky, but turning creation into an idol guiding life by stars instead of the Creator. The story presents a world that replaced worship with obsession. Genesis also records cultural expansion through Cain's lineage. Metal, craftsmen, instruments, music, and the script flips it into a warning. Music that should lift the soul becomes constant noise. Entertainment becomes a fog. Cities become places where reflection dies because silence no longer exists. It's like placing a reactor in the hands of a child. The capability is there, but moral wisdom is missing. Walled cities, lethal weapons, endless stimulation, and, in the darkest version of the story, experiments with life itself, advanced in skill, dead in spirit. This creates a divide between two kinds of people. One side builds empires of stone and metal. The other tries to preserve something older humanity as it was meant to be living, simply moving lightly, dwelling in tents. Two cultures sharing the same planet, but unable to mix like oil and water. The first city is described as a milestone, walls, gates, defense. Imagine fortified entrances, watchtowers, streets dense with activity. Inside, the roar of forges, endless trade, ritualized immorality, worship of power, celebration of giants, luxury mixed with terror, a place where pleasure and fear live side by side. Outside the city, another group is described as choosing a different path, calling on the name of the Lord. No walls, no obsession with weapons. A life close to creation instead of constant construction. They preserve oral memory, old promises, and the hope of rescue. And for generations, the distance between the two worlds acted like a barrier. Until the barrier broke, Genesis describes the breakdown. And while many focus on the heavenly beings in that passage, there's also a human layer. The pull of the city, the attraction of comfort, beauty, status, music, power. The separate people look down from the hills and decide they want what the city offers. They descend, they mix. And when that last separation collapses, corruption spreads like a virus. The flood isn't framed as punishment for a few bad people. It's framed as a world where even the good got absorbed. But while human morality collapses, the story adds something even more grotesque. It suggests corruption in the biological order. Genesis includes a strange phrase: all flesh had corrupted its way. Some read that spiritually. Others read it literally. Flesh as biology, boundaries violated, life distorted. Certain extra-biblical traditions speak of mixing across kinds an ancient taboo, violating the line according to its kind. Think of the creatures carved into ancient stone, hybrids, beasts, half-and-half beings. We label them imagination, but the script poses a disturbing question. What if some legends are not inventions, but stylized memories of a world where boundaries were broken? Genesis 1 sets a pattern. Life reproduces within its kind. Boundary, a safeguard. And if that boundary is violated by rebellion, by pride, by forbidden knowledge, then life becomes unstable. Creatures that don't fit the ecosystem, painful contradictions in nature. Predators too extreme. Systems that collapse under their own imbalance, a world that becomes an open-air laboratory with no ethics. From that angle, the flood changes meaning. Not just wrath, but containment. Not simply punishment, but reset, an attempt to preserve what could still be preserved. The script frames it like cosmic surgery, removing what has spread too far, because by that stage, even the Earth itself is portrayed as infected. And while biology collapses, human society becomes savage. Genesis includes a chilling moment, a man boasting in verse about killing over minor offense, turning violence into art. Not self-defense, pride. A culture where life is worth less than ego, he declares revenge multiplied, creating a world where retaliation becomes infinite. No courts, no justice system, only clans, weapons, and tyrants. Cross the wrong person and you don't just die, your family becomes a target too. Bodies lie in the open. Mercy disappears. The earth is filled with cruelty and oppression. People become objects. Women become trophies. Human beings become currency. And Genesis gives its verdict in one devastating idea. The imagination of the human heart is locked onto evil continuously. Not a bad day, a permanent channel. And then something shifts, something physical. The protective stability people assumed was normal begins to break down. For the first time, they feel something new on their skin. Cold. Not fear chills temperature, a wind that bites. A sensation their ancestors never described because it didn't exist in their experience. People see their own breath, they don't know what it is. Clouds gather thicker than they've ever seen, dark masses swallowing that soft, filtered light. And then comes a sound nobody has ever heard. Thunder, a violent voice in the sky. And then, the first drop. Genesis describes it with striking imagery, waters breaking from beneath and above. Not only rainfall, something tearing open. Ground rupturing, pressure released. Springs erupting, the earth splitting as the sky pours. A double impact. Water from above, water from below. At first, some might reach out to taste the falling water, curious. Others retreat behind walls, trusting engineering, trusting stone, trusting power. But water rises too quickly. Rivers overwhelm their banks instantly. Lowlands disappear, valleys become graves. Those mighty walls meant to keep enemies out now, keep the water in. The cities become sealed, bowls turning into drowning chambers. And in the middle of that chaos, one structure floats. Not a palace, not a fortress. A wooden vessel built for years by a man everyone mocked. A strange box-shaped ark, rising while everything else sinks. As the most violent, advanced, corrupted civilization in the story disappears into mud and water, a door closes, and the silence afterward is terrifying. The world that once felt unstoppable is erased so completely that later generations would call it myth. But the story leaves a warning. If you want, watch the next video on screen to explore how the Ark could have functioned, how it could have held life, and what it meant to be the only refuge when the world outside became unlivable. Click the video on screen and step inside the Ark.